Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the United States government has absolutely no intention of ever paying back its $38 trillion in debt? Not a single cent of it, at least not in the way you have been led to believe. And what if I told you that there is a secret, quiet plan already in motion to simply make that debt disappear? A plan that does not involve tax hikes or budget cuts, but rather utilizes the ancient weight of gold and the modern invisible code of cryptocurrency. We are living through a moment of profound economic transformation. It is a shift that is largely invisible in the daily headlines of the mainstream media, which prefer to focus on political theater and social division. But if we look at the raw data, if we look at the balance sheets of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, a different story emerges. It is a story of how the United States is pulling off the greatest financial magic trick in history. They are quietly erasing the single largest debt burden the world has ever known, and they are doing it while the public is distracted. To understand where we are going, we must first honestly assess where we are by looking at the number that defies human comprehension. If you look at the debt clock in Times Square or check the official figures from the U.S. Treasury, you will see a figure spinning rapidly past $35 trillion, heading with terrifying speed toward $38 trillion. It is difficult for the human mind to process a number of this magnitude, so let us put it into perspective. If you were to stack 38 trillion $1 bills on top of each other, that pile would reach not just to the moon, but beyond it. Or consider this. If you had spent $1 million every single day since the day Jesus was born, you still would not have spent $1 trillion. To match the current United States debt, you would have to repeat that spending spree, $1 million a day since the beginning of the Common Era, 38 times over. It breaks down to approximately $114,000 for every single person in this country. Do you have an extra $114,000 lying around to send to Washington? Does your newborn grandchild? Because, make no mistake, under the current system, they are on the hook, too. For decades, politicians and economists dismissed this number, telling us that deficits do not matter. They told us that we owe the money to ourselves, or that the debt is manageable as long as the economy grows. They treated the national debt like a high score in a video game, a scary number perhaps, but one with no real-world consequences for the average family. But in 2024, the math changed, and we entered a new era of fiscal reality where the debt is no longer just a number on a screen. It has become a predator that is beginning to consume the budget of the United States government. For the first time in history, the U.S. government is spending more on interest payments on the debt than it is spending on national defense. Think about the gravity of that statement. We are spending more to pay off the bondholders of the past than we are to equip the military of the present. We are spending more on interest than on the entire Medicaid program. The interest bill alone is approaching $1 trillion a year. This creates a terrifying economic phenomenon known as the debt spiral or the doom loop. In a normal household, if you have too much debt, you sit down at the kitchen table and make hard choices. You cut your spending, stop eating out, cancel the streaming services, and tighten your belt. But a government is not a household. A massive portion of U.S. government spending is mandatory: Social Security and Medicare. These are promises made to an aging population, to people like you who have worked and contributed your entire lives. These promises cannot be politically broken. So the government cannot meaningfully cut spending. Instead, to pay the interest on the old debt, the government is forced to issue new debt. It is the equivalent of borrowing from a new credit card just to pay the minimum monthly balance on your old credit card. This increases the total debt, which increases the interest payments due next year, which requires even more borrowing. It is a mathematical feedback loop that leads to exponential growth. The terrifying reality is that there is no conventional way out of this trap. If we look at history, and to understand this, you do not need a crystal ball, you only need a history book, we see that there are only 3 ways to reduce a sovereign debt burden of this magnitude, and 2 of them are politically impossible in the United States today. The first option is austerity, which is the eat your vegetables option. It means massive tax hikes and brutal spending cuts. To balance the budget and start paying down the debt, the government would have to double income taxes or abolish the U.S. military. Neither of those things is going to happen. Any politician who proposes cutting Social Security checks by 30% commits political suicide, and any president who proposes a 70% tax rate gets voted out in a landslide. Furthermore, the American economy is addicted to government spending. Pulling the plug abruptly would trigger a Great Depression instantly, so austerity is effectively off the table. The second option is default, where the government could simply walk up to the podium and say, "We are not paying." This is what Argentina or Russia has done in the past. But for the United States, the issuer of the global reserve currency, this is the nuclear option. The entire global financial system, every bank, every pension fund, every trade contract, is built on the foundation that U.S. Treasury bonds are risk-free. If the U.S. explicitly defaults, the global banking system collapses overnight. Trade stops, credit cards stop working, and it would be a financial apocalypse. So explicit default is also off the table. That leaves only one option, the third option, which every empire in history, from Rome to Weimar Germany to post-war Britain, has eventually chosen. It is the path of least resistance, the soft default. You do not refuse to pay the debt. You pay every single cent of it. But you pay it back in currency that is worth significantly less than when you borrowed it, effectively printing the difference. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the official, though unspoken, policy of the United States government. It is a process of financial repression designed to transfer wealth from savers to the state. The goal is to keep the interest rate on the debt lower than the rate of inflation. Let us do the math on how this works for the government. If the government owes $30 trillion and inflation is running at 5%, the real value of that debt shrinks by 5% every year. In purchasing power terms, the government has just erased $1.5 trillion of debt in a single year without raising a single tax or cutting a single program. The bondholders get their money back, but that money buys fewer groceries and fewer houses. We are currently witnessing a historic shift in monetary policy called fiscal dominance. For 40 years, the Federal Reserve was the master, raising interest rates to fight inflation even if it hurt the economy. Today, the Treasury is the master. The debt is so high that the Fed cannot raise interest rates high enough to truly kill inflation, because doing so would bankrupt the U.S. government. If interest rates went to 10%, like they did in the 1980s under Paul Volcker, the interest payments on $38 trillion would be $3.8 trillion a year. That is more than the total tax revenue of the country, and the government would collapse. So the Federal Reserve is forced to tolerate higher inflation, forced to keep rates lower than they should be, and forced to become an enabler of the Treasury's spending. The independence of the central bank is dying, and we are moving into an era where the money printer is permanently fused to the government budget. This is the hidden crisis. It isn't a sudden crash. It is a slow boil. The $38 trillion number will keep going up, hitting 40 trillion, then 50 trillion. But the value of the dollar will keep going down. The government is betting that it can inflate away the debt faster than the market can panic. But this strategy requires compliance. It requires that you, the saver, do not notice the theft until it is too late. To ensure this compliance, the government utilizes specific mechanisms, tools of repression that we need to examine closely. The first of these mechanisms effectively creates a captive buyer for government debt. In a free market, if a government is $38 trillion in debt and spending recklessly, investors would demand a higher interest rate to lend them money. They would say, "You are a risky borrower. Pay me 10%, but the U.S. government cannot afford 10%. So it rigs the market by creating a captive audience through a complex web of banking regulations like Basel III and Dodd-Frank. The government forces banks, insurance companies, and pension funds to hold U.S. Treasury bonds. Regulators designate U.S. Treasuries as high-quality liquid assets, HQLA. Banks are legally required to hold these assets to satisfy their liquidity coverage ratios. It doesn't matter if the bonds pay 0.1% or if they are losing value against inflation. The banks must buy them to stay in business. This creates artificial demand, forcing the financial system to lend money to the government at suppression rates regardless of the risk. Think about your pension fund. It isn't buying government debt because it is a smart investment strategy. It is buying it because it is against the law not to. Beyond rigging the bond market, there's a second, more insidious tool at play: the manipulation of the consumer price index, or what we might call the broken compass. If you want to pay people less, but you promise to pay them based on inflation, the easiest solution is to redefine inflation. Social security payments and tips, Treasury inflation-protected securities, are linked to the consumer price index, CPI. If CPI is 10%, the government has to pay out 10% more in cost of living adjustments. So the government has a multi-billion-dollar incentive to keep the CPI low. Since the 1980s, the methodology for calculating CPI has been quietly rewritten to suppress the official number. They introduced substitution bias. The logic is this: if the price of steak goes up, you won't buy steak, you will buy hamburger. Therefore, the government argues, your cost of living hasn't gone up as much as the price of steak suggests. The CPI tracks the hamburger, effectively ignoring the fact that your standard of living has dropped. They introduced hedonic adjustments. If a new car costs $5,000 more than the old model, but it has better safety features or better stereo, the government argues the price didn't really go up. The price increase is adjusted down because the quality is higher. These statistical sleight-of-hand tricks save the government billions. If we use the methodology from 1980 today, inflation would consistently be double the official number reported on the news. The government is gaslighting you about the cost of your own survival to save its budget. So we have established that the government is erasing the debt by erasing the value of your money. But what happens when people wake up? What happens when you and me and everyone else realizes that our savings accounts are a scam and that the dollar is a melting ice cube? Usually people run for the exits. They dump their dollars and buy anything else: real estate, stocks, commodities. This triggers hyperinflation, and the controlled demolition turns into an uncontrolled collapse. To prevent this, or rather, to survive this, the government needs an anchor. They need a plan B. They need something to restore faith in the system after they finish burning the old one down. This brings us to the most fascinating part of this economic puzzle, involving the assets that the government publicly mocks, but privately hoards. We must begin by talking about gold. To you and me, gold is wealth. It is insurance. But to the people in charge, gold is a barbarous relic. That was the famous line from economist John Maynard Keynes. The U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve never talk about gold as part of their monetary policy. They act as if it is an outdated rock from a bygone era. Then you have to ask one simple burning question. If it is a useless, barbarous relic, why does the United States government hold 8,133.5 metric tons of it? That is the largest official gold reserve in the world. It is more than Germany, Italy, and France combined. The vast majority of it is supposedly held in the United States Bullion Depository at Fort Knox. Why hoard so much of something you publicly call useless? Because it is not useless. It is the fire extinguisher. It is the in case of emergency, break glass plan. Right now, on the U.S. Treasury's official balance sheet, they value their 8,133 tons of gold at a statutory rate of $42.22 an ounce. That is not a joke. That is the official book value, a dead accounting number from the 1970s. At that price, the entire U.S. gold reserve is worth about $11 billion. That is chump change. It wouldn't pay the interest on the national debt for a single week. But at the market price, let us say around $2,300 an ounce, it is worth about $61 billion better, but still not enough to make a dent in $38 trillion. But you are missing the point. The plan is not to sell the gold at the market price. The plan is to reset the entire system and create a new price. This has happened before. We must look to 1933 when President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. This order made it illegal for any American citizen to own gold. You were forced, under penalty of 10 years in prison, to turn in all your gold coins and bullion to the government. They paid you $20.67 per ounce in paper dollars. Then, after the government had collected all the gold, FDR signed the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. With the stroke of a pen, he repriced gold to $35 an ounce. In one day, he devalued the U.S. dollar by nearly 60%. He stole 60% of the purchasing power of anyone holding paper money and transferred that wealth directly to the government's balance sheet. It was the biggest heist in American history, and it was 100% legal. Now, imagine they do it again. Imagine the crisis hits. The debt market is collapsing. Inflation is soaring. The president goes on TV and announces a restoration of faith. To back the U.S. dollar, the official price of gold is set at $50,000 per ounce. Let us do the math. 261.5 million ounces of gold times a new price of $50,000 an ounce equals roughly $13 trillion. Just like that, the Treasury invents $13 trillion in new assets. It didn't have to tax anyone. It didn't have to cut a single program. It just changed a number in a ledger. That $13 trillion can be used to wipe out debt. It can be used to back a new currency. It instantly makes the U.S. balance sheet look solvent again. And what happens to you? If you held paper dollars, your purchasing power is vaporized relative to real assets. But if you held gold, you are protected. The government knows this. That is why other countries, China, Russia, Poland, India, have been on an unprecedented gold buying spree. They are preparing for the exact same moment. They know the dollar's time as the undisputed king is ending, and they know that when the system resets, the countries with the most gold get to sit at the head of the table. However, gold isn't the only asset in this game anymore. In the last 15 years, a new digital relic has appeared, and the government's relationship with it is just as deceptive. I'm talking about cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin. For years, if you listen to the U.S. government, crypto was public enemy number one. It was a tool for criminals, a threat to financial stability, a speculative bubble. They unleashed a coordinated war against it, suing exchanges and debanking crypto companies through Operation Choke Point 2.0. But while they were attacking it in public, look at what they were doing in private. The United States government has become the largest known holder of Bitcoin in the world. They didn't buy it on an exchange like you or I might. They seized it. Over years of law enforcement operations, from the Silk Road seizure to the Bitfinex hack recovery, the Department of Justice has amassed a hoard of at least 325,000 Bitcoin. For a long time, the question was, when will they sell it? But recently, the strategy has shifted. We have seen executive orders and policy shifts, particularly with the transition into 2025, indicating that this Bitcoin is no longer just evidence. It is a strategic reserve. Why would the US government hold an asset it claims to hate? For the same reason they hold gold. It is a second anchor. Consider the brilliance of the current strategy involving ETFs, exchange-traded funds. In 2024 and 2025, the government allowed Wall Street to launch spot Bitcoin ETFs. This brought Bitcoin into the regulated fold of BlackRock and Fidelity. It encouraged average Americans to put their retirement money into these assets. This creates a push and pull dynamic that serves the government perfectly. The push is inflation. They devalue your dollars, making you panic. The pull is the ETF. They offer you a safe, regulated way to buy gold and Bitcoin. As you and millions of others rush into these ETFs to protect your savings, you drive up the price of gold and Bitcoin. And who is the biggest holder of gold and Bitcoin? The US government. By trying to protect yourself from the government's inflation, you are enriching the government's balance sheet. You are the engine driving up the value of their reserves, which they will eventually use to recapitalize the system. It is a closed loop, a self-feeding dragon. But we must ask, what does the reset actually look like for you? What happens the day after the music stops? To answer this, we need to discuss the endgame, or what we might call Plan C. The government cannot simply keep inflating forever. Eventually, the numbers get too big, and confidence collapses. At that point, history suggests a systemic readjustment. Imagine a scenario where banks and financial markets are closed for a security holiday, perhaps 72 hours. When they reopen, we are introduced to a new monetary reality. In 1923, Weimar Germany ended its hyperinflation by introducing a new currency, the Rentenmark, and converting old marks at a rate of 1 trillion to 1. They wiped out the zeros. In doing so, they wiped out the entire middle class of savers. The US version might look like a great conversion. The government could announce that old dollars are being replaced by a new currency. Perhaps the conversion rate is 10 to 1. If you had $100,000 in savings, you now have $10,000 of the new currency. They will tell you, don't worry, prices will adjust. Bread will cost 10 times less. But history tells us that wages and savings always lose in these conversions, while hard assets retain their value. In this scenario, we must clearly identify who bears the cost and who reaps the reward. The clear losers in this situation begin with your grandmother on a fixed pension. Does her $3,000 a month check get converted fairly, or does her purchasing power vanish? The losses extend to the responsible saver who kept money in the bank, as they effectively lose 90% of their wealth relative to real assets. Even foreign nations holding US debt are not spared, as China and Japan get paid back in new dollars worth a fraction of the old ones, essentially a default by another name. On the other hand, the winners are just as identifiable. The government itself wins decisively. Its $38 trillion debt is mathematically reduced, and its gold and Bitcoin reserves are revalued to astronomical heights to back the new currency. The irresponsible debtor also wins. If you have a massive fixed-rate mortgage in old dollars and inflation skyrockets before the reset, your debt becomes negligible. But there is one final, darker component to this new system that we must confront, which is the mechanism of control. When the new currency is introduced, it likely won't be paper. It will be digital. We need to talk about the CBDC, the central bank digital currency. For years, the Federal Reserve, in partnership with MIT, Project Hamilton, has been researching a digital dollar. Unlike Bitcoin, which is decentralized and private, a CBDC is centralized and programmable. The dangers of a CBDC cannot be overstated. It is not just a new form of money, it is a digital control grid. With physical cash, you have freedom. If the bank charges negative interest rates, you can pull your cash out and put it under a mattress. Cash is the ultimate check on government power. A CBDC removes that exit. If the dollar becomes purely digital, the landscape changes dramatically. The Fed can implement negative interest rates instantly, potentially deducting 1% from your balance every month to force you to spend, stimulating the economy whether you want to or not. They can implement expiry dates, where a stimulus check vanishes if you don't spend it within 30 days. They can even control what you buy, with the potential to deny purchases if you exceed a carbon footprint allowance. Now, you might have heard that in early 2025, there was political movement to ban the CBDC. Executive orders were signed, promises were made to stop the digital prison, and this is true. There's a faction within the US leadership that recognizes the danger. However, we must be vigilant. The infrastructure for this technology has been built. The Bank for International Settlements, BIS, has openly stated that the goal is absolute control over the rules and regulations of money use. Even if a CBDC is paused today, it remains the ultimate tool for a government in a crisis. When the debt spiral reaches its climax, when the banking system freezes, the government may offer a Fed wallet or a digital dollar as the only solution to restore order. People who are desperate, people who cannot access their savings, will not care about privacy. They will care about survival. They will accept the digital leash in exchange for the ability to buy food. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you believe these economic shifts and the potential introduction of digital control grids will ultimately strengthen or weaken the American middle class? Let us discuss in the comments below. So, where does this leave us in terms of practical action? We are entering the end of the risk-free era. For the last 40 years, the standard advice for Americans, work hard, save 10%, buy government bonds, was good advice. It was the 60-40 portfolio. It worked because we were in a period of falling interest rates and stable money. That era is dead. In a world of fiscal dominance, saving in cash is financial suicide. If the inflation rate is higher than your bank's interest rate, you are guaranteed to lose. The government has turned the economy into a casino where you're forced to speculate just to survive. You are being forced to leave the safety of the shore and swim in the volatile waters of assets, stocks, real estate, precious metals, and yes, even digital assets. The American dream of saving your way to prosperity has been replaced by the game of asset survival. However, we must take a step back and look beyond the mechanics of survival to see the broader horizon. We need to understand what this means for the soul of our economy and the future of the American family. When we talk about fiscal responsibility, we often point fingers at Washington, and rightfully so. The abdication of duty by our elected officials has been staggering, but true economic resilience cannot be legislated from the top down. It must be built from the bottom up. It begins at the kitchen table. We are entering a period where the social contract is fundamentally changing. For 3 generations, the implied promise was that if you were a good citizen, if you trusted the banks and the government, you would be taken care of. That promise has been broken by the mathematics of debt. But this does not mean the end of American prosperity. It means the definition of that prosperity is shifting. We are moving away from an economy built on debt-fueled consumption and back toward an economy built on production and genuine savings. This transition will be painful, yes, but it is also an opportunity to reclaim our economic sovereignty. The new American dream is no longer about leveraging yourself to the hilt to buy things you do not need. It is about ownership. It is about holding assets that have no counterparty risk, assets that do not rely on a politician's promise or a banker's algorithm. This is a return to the values that built this nation before the era of easy money. It is a return to the idea that wealth is not printed, but created. The families that survive and thrive in this coming decade will be the ones who understand that they are the central bank of their own lives. You cannot rely on the nanny state to preserve your purchasing power when the state itself is the entity devouring it. We must also look at economic resilience as an act of patriotism. A nation of dependent, indebted citizens is weak and easily controlled. A nation of solvent, asset-owning citizens is strong and ungovernable in the best sense of the word. By protecting your own family's wealth, by stepping out of the debt spiral and into hard assets, you are not just helping yourself. You are helping to stabilize the foundation of the country. You are removing your consent from the system of devaluation. Think about the legacy you're leaving. If you leave your children a pile of depreciating currency, you are leaving them a burden. If you leave them hard assets, gold, land, sound digital property, you're leaving them a fortress. This is how we rebuild the middle class, not through government handouts, but through intergenerational stewardship of real value. The road ahead will be volatile. The great liquidation will wash away the illusions of paper wealth. But for those who are prepared, for those who value independence over convenience, this is not a funeral for America. It is a rebirth. It is the end of the artificial and the return of the real. The verdict is clear. The United States government is defaulting. It is a slow, polite, and bureaucratic default, hidden behind complex terms like yield curve control and quantitative easing, but it is a default nonetheless. The $38 trillion will never be paid back in real terms. The winners will be those who own scarce assets, things that cannot be printed. The losers will be those who trust the currency and the institutions to protect them. I'm not a financial advisor. I cannot tell you what to buy or sell, but I can tell you to look at what they do, not what they say. They say gold is a relic, yet they hoard more of it than anyone else. They say crypto is dangerous, yet they have built a strategic reserve of it. They say inflation is temporary, yet they engineer it to liquidate their debts. The transfer of wealth is happening right now. It is happening every time you go to the grocery store and see the prices tick up. It is happening every time your savings account interest fails to keep up with reality. The storm is coming. The debt is being erased. And the only question that remains is, will you be the collateral damage or will you be prepared? Friends, thank you for your time today. If you found value in this analysis, please like this video and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of informed citizens. Together, we can navigate the changes ahead. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and keep your eyes on the horizon.